Financial Argument. Follow us on YouTube.
Let's get into the economic collapse financial news. Now, the downturn of the economy is starting to speed up. This is not a slow glide to a collapse of the system. We're starting to see many indicators showing that we're already in a recession, heading towards a depression, and there's really nothing the central banks, nothing they can do at this point, unless they do one thing: change the rules. And that's what they're about to do. We talked about the collapse. We talked about how this is going to happen in multiple phases. And we know that phase one, they're going to have to do something to scare governments, not just here in the U.S., scare governments around the world to change the rules. Now, we saw a huge drop in gold. Last time we saw this, something happened. Well, it looks like something is about to happen. And last time we saw this, where it dropped down to 1,000, the Brexit was coming up. Well, this time, we don't know exactly what it is. But we know that when they do this type of suppression, something occurs. And we know the central banks, they need more control to keep the system alive. Because what they're doing right now, it's not working. The economy is deteriorating very, very quickly. When we look out at the Eurozone, we see the economic growth in the 19-country Eurozone, well, it has completely lost momentum. We see markets purchasing managers index for the Eurozone, well, it has dropped to 52.6 from 52.9. This is a 20-month low. And if it goes below 50, we're in contraction, and we're headed to that point. We see ADP came out with their employment numbers, and it looks like the U.S. economy only added 154,000 jobs in September, missing their expectations of 165,000. And remember, a lot of these numbers are manipulated. They can't even fudge the manipulated numbers that well anymore. This is the weakest print since April. But when we look at manufacturing, it is down by 6,000 jobs. Absolutely awful. When we look at ADP services, they're telling us that jobs are piling up. People are getting into retail. People are going into the food business. But we see the restaurant performance index dropping to all-time lows. And they're telling us that people are getting jobs in this area. Someone's lying here. And we can see right now from the amount of restaurants that are closing, that are declaring bankruptcy, stores that are closing, we're seeing it's contracting, not expanding. And we see right now they're making excuses of why these numbers are the way they are. They're saying that job growth has slowed in recent months because we're approaching full employment, which is absolutely ridiculous because these employment numbers are completely fake, phony, and false. They're manipulated. They're not even real. But they have to give some type of an excuse. That's why they give excuses like speculators. This is why they tell you that we're near full employment. This is why they tell you, well, the employment numbers really don't tell the whole story. Retail really doesn't tell the whole story. We're not a manufacturing country anymore. We're a service country. We're no longer a service country. We're a paper-pushing country. I mean, they come up with so many different excuses, it's getting ridiculous already. So right now we see ISM services. It just surged out of nowhere. And what's very strange about this is that business optimism about the year ahead is at one of the lowest levels since the global financial crisis. Now, we've seen this before, where the ISM services all of a sudden surged up. And you know what happened right after that? We had the 2008-2009 Great Recession. We are at the same point right now. And market is out there. Even with the latest increase, they're saying that the economy is still growing at an annualized rate of only 1%. They continually revise GDP lower and lower and lower. And then we have factory orders. They have been declining for 22 straight months in a row, the longest non-recessionary streak in U.S. history. Remember, the government is not going to call a recession. They usually don't do it until months after the recession. We are in a recession right now. When we look at all these economic indicators, they are showing that we are in a recession heading towards a depression, because a lot of these indicators are worse than 2008, 2009, when we were in the Great Recession. So something's wrong. And the government, as we know, it loves to lie to the people. Right now, the world is in $152 trillion worth of debt. This is a record-breaking level of debt. This is more than 2 times the size of the global economy. Remember, the central bankers, that's their business, debt. They love debt. And we can see right now, they want to push more debt, because if they don't, their system comes crashing down. And this is why they're always trying to push debt. Now, we see gold and silver, they've been suppressed. And we know that central banks, the banking system, we know that they manipulate the gold and silver markets. And back in April, when Deutsche Bank agreed to settle the July 2014 lawsuit alleging precious metals manipulation by a group of banks like Deutsche Bank, Bank of Nova Scotia, HSBC, UBS, they were all accused of manipulating prices in the multi-billion-dollar market. Now, the lawsuit was originally filed in New York District Court by litigator J. Scott Nicholson, a resident of Washington, D.C. He alleged that the banks, which were overseeing the century-old silver fix, manipulated the physical and COMEX futures market since January of 2007. The lawsuit subsequently received a class action status. It was the first case to target the silver fix. Now, 6 months ago, not only had the lawsuit against precious metals manipulation not been swept away, but the lead defendant, German bank Deutsche Bank, agreed to settle the litigation over allegations it conspired with Bank of Nova Scotia, HSBC, to fix the silver prices. Now, terms of the settlement, of course, were not disclosed. But what we're seeing right now, U.S. District Judge Valerie Caproni, well, she ruled that investors are now allowed to pursue antitrust and manipulation claims against the Bank of Nova Scotia, HSBC Holding, clearing the way for silver manipulation price fixing litigation. So we can see right now, yes, indeed, the banks do manipulate the precious metals market. And it goes further than that. It goes all the way up to the central banks. Because every time we see the gold and silver prices suppressed, all of a sudden we see thousands upon thousands upon thousands of contracts thrown at it all at once. Now, we know the central bankers, as many would say, they're running out of ammunition. So what do they need to do? They need to change the rules. And we've been talking about this. We've been talking about phase 1 of this collapse. And the IMF came out with their latest report on financial stability and warned that the risks to financial stability are growing. It warned about what it calls medium-term dangers in both emerging and developed economies. And they expressed concerns about Europe, which we know Europe is completely falling apart. So, as this system continually deteriorates, it would leave about a quarter of banks in developed countries too weak to support further growth, and they would be very susceptible to future shocks, because these banks are controlling about 12 trillion of assets, and they're vulnerable right now. So what we're seeing is the central banks are looking for ways to help the banking system, not the people, the banking system. We have to understand that over 25% of banks in advanced economies, and they have about 11.7 trillion in assets, well, they would remain weak and face significant structural challenges if something should happen. So, what is the IMF suggesting? Well, they want to change the rules. How do they change the rules? Well, they need governments. They need their help. They need to change rules of the banking system. They need legal changes. They need legislation. And what they want to do, the central bankers, they want a way to make it easier for banks to get rid of their bad loans. So, for instance, if there was a bank in Europe and they have a loss of about 80 billion euros and they were able to just get rid of some of the bad loans, they might be able to change their whole banking status around and maybe gain 60 billion euros. They're saying Italian banks, Greek banks, they would be one of the biggest beneficiaries of such changes. And this would allow all European banks to do this. And it would boost the bank's profitability. Where would these bad loans go? We don't know right now. But this is what they're trying to do. You see, it's already starting. So how are they going to convince governments that this is the right thing to do? Because you know it's not going to stop in Europe. Japan is going to do this. We're going to see the U.S. do this. Canada is going to do it. It's going to spread. And all the central banks are going to say, yes, we need this ability. But the question is, when they place this legislation into the governments, how do they get it passed? Because you know they're not just going to do it. Maybe they will. But the people are going to be very angry with this because then everyone should be able to get rid of their bad loans or their bad debt. So most likely they are already preparing for the first phase of the collapse where they need to change the legislation to allow the central banks to do more. And they've already started the process. Now, what they're going to do is they're going to introduce this. They're going to see what the governments are willing to do. And if they cannot get this passed on their own, we will see an event, and most likely a financial event, to scare governments into doing this. And maybe even doing more. Because we know this is not the only thing they want to change. They want to change a lot more. And what we're seeing right now is the beginning stages. And that means the first phase of the collapse is not that far off. Because when the central bankers don't get their way and governments do not cooperate, well, guess what? They're going to put the fear of a collapsing society into the people and into the governments to make them do what they want. And we're at stage 1 of this. Listen, everyone, thanks a lot for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.